Chapter 18. The First Loyalty. Reddy was back in South Florida. Months had elapsed since the field trials, and spring was already evident in the new growth on the trees and the colorful flowers of hibiscus, oleander, and humbler shrubs. The days were sunny and hot, and the breezes were full of pleasant odors. It was only natural that the mockingbirds were bursting with song, and everything and everybody was feeling the exhilaration which comes with the change from the drab months to those with color and new life. But Reddy was listless and low-spirited. He lay most of the day at the threshold of the cottage, his head on his paws, and only his eyes following the movements of those around him. At first, no one took much notice of this, but as his doleful attitude continued, it soon became a matter of general concern. Johnny, who was working hard on new fences and lawn grading, tried to cheer him, but did not accomplish much. Reddy would always wag his tail and stand up, but show none of his former enthusiasm. Finally, even Mr. Marshall said that something should be done about it. And then Johnny received an airmail letter from Alberta. It arrived at breakfast time when he and the Marshall family were at the table discussing whether the time had come to go back to the ranch. The letter was one of those short, official ones, stating that the office of ranger in the Little Sheep Creek section of the Athabasca Valley was open, and asking whether Johnny cared to apply for it. In other words, suggested Marshall, your old position is offered to you. Well, you know what to tell them. You have a position with me, which I hope will last a lifetime. You need not think of the wilds of Alberta anymore. Johnny appreciated this. He'd been treated as a close friend and had taken into a very delightful home by people who he thoroughly liked and admired. But for some reason, which he himself could not analyze, he wanted more than anything else in the world to be back in the Alberta mountains, guarding the forests and the wild animals that needed protection to survive. Rising with the sun to look out on a world of peaks where there was no sign of man, retiring at night under the soft sheen of the northern lights, to sleep without a care. The call of the wild, that was what best described it, but it was centered in the cool Alberta mountains which he knew so intimately, and in his former happy duties as a ranger there. While he had not admitted that he had been homesick, the coming of the letter, coupled with the knowledge that spring would soon be creeping gloriously over the mountains, brought things to a head. He and Reddy had that in common, he knew, homesickness. Or else why had the big active hound begun to mope about the place so dejectedly? Johnny had always suspected that Reddy missed the king, and in his unusually alert mind he would never forget him. The fact that the hound had not cared to be at all friendly with dogs other than his sisters and brother proved that he was different from the ordinary. Having been with big wolves and known them so intimately, he seemed to feel disdainful of dogs and almost hostile to them. Johnny thought of all of this as he sat regarding Reddy after breakfast. The hound's big eyes, as usual, never left his face, and seemed to say, I've put all my trust in you, and I know that you'll always do the best you can for me. But something in the depth of those eyes haunted Johnny. There was much that seemed unusually human about this strange, faithful, lovable hound, that among men had given allegiance to him alone. I owe something to you, old friend, thought Johnny, and I think I know what you want, and I'm going to try to give it to you. And the strange thing about that is that I want it too. So he sought out Marshall and told him that he was going back to Alberta, with Reddy. Marshall nodded. I knew you would, he said simply. Your spirits go up and down with Reddy's. That hound has that effect on you, and he's forcing you now. His will is so powerful that he almost has me going too. I've watched him year in and year out just as you have. I've seen him trying hard to make the best of things as they come along. He has one great desire to please you, and that carried him along until now. But I believe he never forgot Alberta for 1 minute, And now it's got the better of him, and I really believe that he'll just pine away and die unless you take him back. And I believe, too, that his wolf friend is mixed up in this thing." Johnny's decision was something that concerned every member of the family. For the next few days, that was all they talked about, and they knew that it would be decided to make a change in their lives. They would miss Reddy every moment, beginning with the early morning when they came to breakfast and were greeted by him, each in turn, with such friendly enthusiasm and evident joy in seeing them again after the night's separation, that they were at once put in a good humor that lasted all day. As for Johnny, he knew that he was making the most fateful decision of his life, particularly as he was beginning to fall in love. Patricia was not such a child as he'd first imagined, and in the last year she'd seemed to grow much older suddenly. He and she had always had a liking for each other, and now that a separation was coming, Johnny, who'd never been affected this way, felt a decided heartache. That she shared his feeling to some extent at least was shown only in the affection which she lavished more than ever upon Reddy, who, wise dog that he was, took it very impersonally, as if knowing full well that he was just being made a go-between. Rather sad were those last few days, but not too sad. And then Johnny and Reddy were off for Alberta by train, Reddy riding in the baggage car, in an especially made crate, from which Johnny released him for a walk whenever the train made a lengthy stop. It took nearly a week to complete the long journey, with all the transfers from one railroad to another. Johnny had written to Mac, but he had given him no date, for he planned to have the train stop at Mac's little station, and step out quite casually just to surprise him, and get that kind of hearty greeting which he somehow craved for his return. And it happened exactly as he hoped it would. The train blew a warning whistle, which brought Mac out on the platform before it showed up. After rounding the bend, Johnny swung off the train almost on top of him. And after that first look of astonishment, he was given a rousing series of punches as Mac danced around him shouting, "You old hoss, it can't be!" Reddy was released from the crate and nearly went wild, jumping and baying and prancing about the men. "Suppose you want to stay at the castle," grinned Mac, "to get sort of acclimated before you go to your palace up on the creek?" Johnny thought he was jesting when he said palace, but later when he and Mac rode to the ridge, he found out that this was not the case. The government had not just rebuilt the burnt cabin, but it had erected a real little bungalow, with a hot water heater and all sorts of conveniences. Johnny could not believe his eyes. Also, Mac had hurriedly brought in a few pieces of furniture, dishes, cooking utensils, and bedding, as well as a fair amount of groceries, the kind that he knew that Johnny liked. "Just to sort of start you right," he said. He said it apologetically, but with sparkling eyes because of the pleasure which he saw in Johnny's face. Besides Johnny's old riding horse, Mac gave him one to carry packs, and helped him make both horses comfortable in the stable shack. For though a good month of May was well underway, the nights in the peaks were still too cold for horses to be turned out to take care of themselves. Reddy came in for some of Mac's attention. "He's a great dog. From the paper clippings you've sent me so often, I gather he's licked the varmints and dogs of just about the whole continent, clear down to the tip of Florida. He looks it. He's bigger and a lot more powerful than when he left here. Or perhaps I've just forgotten his size. Sometime I want to see those two-handled silver cups you wrote that he's won. I didn't tell you that poor Bess is dead. Poison. Yeah, somebody spread it all around the mountains last year at trapping season, with you being away. It just about cleaned up the foxes and the wolves. By the way, it occurs to me I haven't seen or heard King since then. I guess they took him too." Johnny looked up slowly, his brows knitting. "The King gone? Was it Bill and Mose? I shouldn't wonder." "Then," said Johnny, "I'm afraid they've at last succeeded in hitting Reddy." He glanced at the hound lying in the middle of the room, with his head resting quietly on his front paws, but his eyes ever watchful. "We'll just have to wait and see." "What are you talking about, anyway?" asked Mac, completely mystified. "I'm not sure I know myself," answered Johnny, "but I have a feeling that Reddy will go back to the wolves." "And you'll let him?" "Yes," said Johnny slowly. "I'll let him. For later, when it's over, he'll come back to me, and then he'll stay." "What do you mean by when it's over?" "Mac, he'll go with the wolves as long as the king is alive, or until he's hunted all the ground all the way to the porcupine and can't find him. I come second to king. He and I both found that out down in the States." "If I didn't know you so well, old hoss, I'd say you were cracked in the head. You're saying that an animal can think and remember just like you can?" Johnny shook his head. "Reddy's no ordinary animal," he replied quickly, "and his loyalty is so strong that it carries him to greater heights mentally than those which the ordinary animal can reach. At first it seemed like he only missed the wolf, and that was bad enough. But now I think he misses him and also worries about him. The first phase was selfish, the second largely unselfish, and the stronger of the two. I may be all wrong, of course, but he and I are very close to each other, and sort of in sympathy and understanding. You get what I mean? He's not one to rush things. He's lying there quietly enough, making sure I'm all right. I, his second loyalty. But you can notice that his heart is pounding. He's thinking about tomorrow when he intends to start off on his hunt." "Whew," whistled Mac. "Don't let just anyone know how nutty you are." And then he added, "I think I'll stick around just to see how wrong you can be. If it happens that way and the hound goes wild again, I'll bet the authorities will go wild too." Johnny, regardless of everything, slept like a log that night, and woke in the morning dreaming that he was in Alberta, only to find that it was true. Mac was fussing with pots and pans, and soon had good ham and eggs and coffee on the table. He said little during the meal, his eyes continually wandering to Reddy, who ate slices of the ham he'd been given, and then lay down as before. Presently, when the dishes were cleared away, Johnny went to the door. Instantly Reddy arose and stood beside him. Slowly Johnny stepped outside, with Reddy still keeping beside him. Together they stood on the path and looked across the valley, and over to the snow-streaked mountains beyond. And then Reddy went several paces down the path in the direction of the place where as a pup he'd been dumped from the pack horse. Mac stayed in the doorway, an odd, strained expression on his unusually jovial face as he watched. He sensed at last that a near tragedy might be happening. It might be unfolding before his very eyes. The separation of a man and his dog, perhaps forever. He knew loneliness, and what it meant in the mountains to lose companionship of a devoted animal that one loved. He'd gone through that when his fine old white-faced riding horse, whom he'd had almost as a constant companion for years, fell and broke a leg. And then later, when Bess died of the poison, lying on blankets in his little cabin, while he tried so hard to save her. "Don't let him go, old hoss. Hold on to him, you locoed fool," he growled to himself. "Where will you ever get another like him?" Reddy had stopped and was looking first down the slope and then back at Johnny. His fine head was held high, but his tail was no longer jauntily above his long back. He walked a few steps further and stopped again. Johnny called him and he hurried back. The ranger sat down on a flat rock and gently smoothed his hand over the hound's soft-coated head and ears, looking into his honest, troubled eyes and trying to smile. "Goodbye, old friend," he said very quietly. "And remember, whether or not you find him, I'll be waiting for you." It was just as if the hound understood his words. He licked first one and then the other of Johnny's hands, and then he turned and trotted down the path without a backwards glance, but with such unhappiness in the way he carried himself that even Mac could see that he was suffering. The two men remained where they were for many minutes. They saw the hound appear in the timber in the valley below, and then begin the ascent on the other side. His nose was far forward, his tail straight out behind. He was loping fast, silently, and with caution. Reddy was a wolf again. A cow moose and her leggy, very young calf leapt up and trotted suddenly from the low bushes in his path. Reddy looked at them, but did not change his pace or direction. Soon he was entering the timber once more. The men strained their eyes, but lost all sight of him. Presently, clearing his throat gruffly, Mac turned around and busied himself in the bungalow. Johnny sat on that stone for a long time. End of chapter 18.